Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix: a little information, a few stats, some real world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee.
This episode has gravity. We begin with what you didn't see in the news. 15 pressure shifts that never owned the front page but quietly rewired the substrate. Post-quantum migration becoming a board-level checklist. Data center politics turning compute into zoning fights. Vibe coding supply chains morphing into attack surfaces. Sovereign AI drifting from buzzword to industrial policy. Then we wake up ready, mapping a compression cycle where oil, silver, Treasury auctions, payrolls, and CPI become gating variables in a system with less margin for error. From there, a knowledge bomb. Regime instability in Iran reframing the Strait of Hormuz. After that, humor me. Auto loans as the last Renaissance fair of modern finance, where monthly payments eclipse total cost. Then the greater debate. Adams versus Hitchens on intervention, empire, and responsibility. And finally, let's invent again Bob Widlar and the analog layer that lets atoms speak to silicon, and why these interfaces still compound.
A quick thank you to our sponsor, Nost Moments at nostmoments.io. Share your most precious memories. Share the Nost Moments. Let's start off with what you didn't see in the news. Stories that never really owned the front page but moved fast underneath it. These are pressure changes, technical, political, behavioral, and taken together, they're the same thing: the world quietly rewiring itself. Beginning with the most unglamorous kind of urgency, post-quantum cryptography is moving from someday into project plans. Here's the punchline: your strongest encryption isn't being broken today, it's being banked for later. And leadership is starting to treat that as a timeline problem. The chatter isn't academic anymore. It's inventories of where public key crypto lives, roadmaps for swapping algorithms without breaking systems, and practical engineering guidance in the standards ecosystem. The second-order consequence is that the winners won't be a single algorithm. They'll be the people and platforms that make migration survivable. Crypto agility tooling, managed upgrades, hardware security modules that don't melt down during a swap. And it popped this week because preparedness is getting measurable. Once there's a readiness score and a checklist, boards can ask the question, and someone has to own the answer.
So we're not watching quantum computers arrive. We're watching accountability arrive.
Exactly. Now, zoom out from math to concrete. Data centers are running into what you could call silicophobia, local backlash, not against technology in the abstract, but against water, power, noise, and land use. The tell is that this isn't just angry op-eds. It's bills, moratorium talk, and utility politics in multiple states and municipalities. The quiet detail is why this matters. The constraint doesn't erase demand, it reroutes it. That means sudden premiums for sites with permits and transmission access, a new market for friendly jurisdictions, and a politics layer on top of AI capacity planning. It showed up this week because the debate crossed a threshold. Enough proposals and headlines that big operators and public officials are responding in public, not just negotiating behind closed doors.
Once the fight is who pays for grid upgrades, it stops being a tech story and becomes a household economic story.
Which tees up a risk that looks small until it isn't: vibe coding supply chain attacks. When software gets generated at scale, the fragile part isn't the model. It's the dependency line you didn't mean to copy. What's circulating is the idea of phantom or hallucinated packages. An AI assistant suggests an import that sounds right but doesn't exist, and attackers can register that exact name and wait for installs. This is how a workflow turns into an attack surface. The implication is a new class of guardrails: verification of provenance and intent, not just scanning code after the fact. Think, did a human mean this dependency as a security control? Plus insurance models and DevOps policy that assume AI-written code is probabilistic. It spiked this week because the technique is now being treated as a category. People are writing mitigations and postures, not just sharing a spooky anecdote. Now take that same supply chain logic and apply it to nations. Sovereign AI infrastructure. Countries are increasingly acting like renting intelligence from someone else's stack is a strategic vulnerability. You can hear it in policy language, data localization rules, tech sovereignty debates, regulated domestic clouds, and in the diplomatic pushback, too. The key point is that this isn't a vibe, it's governance. Who holds the data, who controls compute, what gets hosted where, and what happens in a geopolitical rupture. Second order, compute starts to resemble energy security. Domestic GPU capacity, cooling, and trusted model supply become industrial policy, not corporate IT. It popped this week because the posture got louder. New guidance, more explicit diplomatic positioning, and more public friction over cross-border data rules.
The cloud stops being a neutral utility and starts looking like a flag on a server rack.
And flags need power, literal power. Which brings us to a clean milestone that still hasn't been digested. Solar passed hydro on the U.S. grid using final 2025 generation data. The headline isn't "renewables are up." It's that a legacy workhorse got overtaken by a technology that's still in its growth curve phase. That changes the grid conversation. Variability becomes central, and storage stops being an accessory and starts being the mechanism that turns solar abundance into reliability. The follow-on effects are rural land economics, interconnection queues, and the business models around batteries and grid services. It popped this week because the finalized numbers landed, an official line in the sand that makes the trend feel real to people who ignore monthly charts. Staying with power, just a different kind, BBC World Service is launching a series called Inheritance, Samsung, according to podcast industry announcements being circulated this week. The reason it's interesting isn't celebrity or nostalgia, it's governance. Corporate dynasties don't just allocate capital, they shape institutions, incentives, and national industrial trajectories. With Samsung, you're talking about a company that sits near the center of semiconductor geopolitics and Korea's industrial identity. The second-order payoff is a lens. Family capitalism as a way to understand how national champions behave under pressure. It popped this week because the show's release cycle became real. An announcement with a date and a clear Season 1 framing, enough to ignite early buzz before the first episode lands. Now, the mirror image of abundance. Media. We're seeing a content supply shock. AI-generated podcast factories producing thousands of episodes a week. The interesting part isn't the novelty, it's the economics. When the marginal cost of an episode collapses, the scarce resource becomes trust and discovery. That shifts advantage to curation, network brands, and verification. Anything that signals, this is worth 40 minutes of your life. And the ad market gets weird. A flood of cheap inventory can distort pricing, even if listeners don't love the content. It bubbled up this week because the scale is now being discussed as a market event. Industry outlets are treating it like a structural change, not a stunt.
I don't know about you, but some of the AI-generated podcasts are pretty good. Either way, the creator economy turns into an attention economy in the strictest sense. Attention is the only scarce input left.
Which ties directly into search. Information gain SEO is having a moment. Basically, the backlash to AI fluff, formalized. People are noticing that generic explainers have become invisible because AI can summarize them instantly. So the play becomes differentiation, original data, first-hand reporting, unique analysis, things the model can't just remix from 5 similar pages. The implication is a publishing reset. Volume SEO weakens, and proprietary datasets and expert authority become moats again. It popped this week because the phrase is spreading as a practical framework. Marketers and publishers are using it as an organizing principle, not a buzzword. Now let's take a temperature check on risk appetite by looking at some more keywords. Bitcoin going to zero hit record search intensity in the US. That's not a fundamentals story, it's a psychology story. When people type doom into the search bar, you get a raw signal about stress, crowding, and fear. The second-order reason to care is timing. Extreme sentiment can coincide with forced selling or capitulation dynamics, even if it's not a clean contrarian indicator. And it popped this week because the spike hit an unmistakable peak. Plus, these phrases spread mimetically. One viral doubt becomes 1,000 private searches.
It's a retail panic index, messy but sometimes more honest than surveys.
From sentiment back to operations, Burger King expanding AI in the drive-through stack. The most important detail here is that this isn't someday robots. It's an AI assistant living in headsets, surfacing recipes, flagging inventory issues, and even scoring interactions for friendliness cues. The implications are very grounded. Franchise-level CapEx, edge compute requirements, and a whole vendor ecosystem around voice accuracy, audio QA, and workflow integration. Once these systems become standard, the real competition is reliability. How often it helps instead of a noise. It popped this week because deployment details got concrete. Scale of tests, features, and the sense that this is moving from pilot theater to rollout logic. Now to biotech, where nuance matters more than headlines. Grail's NHS Gallery trial updates and the stage 4 reduction attention. The story's tension is that you can have an encouraging signal and still miss the primary endpoint. The conversation is about what the trial actually demonstrated: fewer stage 4 diagnoses in the intervention arm, while the combined late-stage endpoint didn't clear statistical significance in the way people wanted. Grail's own release even acknowledges that. Why it matters goes beyond one company. If multi-cancer early detection shifts stage distribution at scale, it changes treatment pathways, insurer incentives, and healthcare economics. But the evidence bar is high and the endpoints are everything. It popped this week because the update forced a repricing of expectations. The market loves a simple win. Trials usually offer a complicated paragraph.
Biotech is where the headline is optional, but the denominator is mandatory.
And the denominator for AI is physical infrastructure, especially cooling. Liquid cooling and AI HPC retrofits are becoming a re-rating narrative, with crypto mining operators pivoting toward HPC hosting. The basic fact is straightforward. GPU-dense racks generate heat profiles that a lot of legacy infrastructure can't handle without serious upgrades, and that upgrade path is increasingly central to the pivot story. Second order. We may see an asset repricing cycle where power access plus permits plus retrofit-ready buildings become the scarce bundle, not just square footage. This popped this week because the pivot conversation is getting quantified in mainstream finance research. More analysts are describing it as a strategic transformation rather than opportunistic PR. Let's bring it down to personal economics, but keep it national. Scam prevention as strategy. The Bank Policy Institute published their Fraud and Scam Prevention Playbook. The point is that fraud has become an ecosystem problem. Telecoms, banks, platforms, and law enforcement each hold part of the solution, and the gaps between them are where scammers live. The implication is that scams are now infrastructure, especially with AI making impersonation cheaper and more scalable. So prevention looks like standards, shared signals, and modernized enforcement pipelines. And we'll close with a technical countertrend to frontier model hype, small model viability, Stirling 8B, and the broader 8B class conversation. The attention grab is interpretability. Guide Labs is pitching a model that can trace tokens back to inputs, concepts, and training influences in a more native way than post hoc explainers. And TechCrunch highlighted the release this week. The implication is deployment economics. Smaller, more auditable models open paths for local inference, edge AI, privacy-forward workflows, and regulated environments that can't tolerate because the model said so as an explanation. It popped this week because builders started treating it as an option, not a curiosity. New releases become real when engineers ask, "Can I ship this?" All right, zooming out for the pattern. First, AI is getting dragged into the physical world. Zoning, power, cooling, headsets, and infrastructure are now part of the model's story. Second, trust is being repriced everywhere. Search wants information gain, media wants verification, finance wants cleaner sentiment tells, and households want fraud defenses that actually work. Third, the future is arriving as migrations. Crypto systems migrating to post-quantum encryption, compute migrating toward sovereignty, and entire asset classes migrating toward new definitions of strategic. That's what you didn't see in the news, not 15 headlines, one substrate changing. Now let's wake up ready. We're shaking up the format for Wake Up Ready. We hope you like it. The cycle we're in right now is not a recession cycle. It's not a melt-up cycle either. It's a compression cycle. Policy is restrictive. Inflation hasn't fully normalized, sovereign borrowing remains heavy, commodity supply is structurally tight, and now, layered on top of that, we have a sudden geopolitical escalation involving Iran, Israel, and the United States. The dominant condition is reduced margin for error. Silver has been the visible stress test. Deliverability concerns, shrinking registered inventories, and exchange halts reminded markets that benchmarks only work when settlement works. Now that microstructure fragility sits inside live energy risk. That's the phase. A system where pricing power, liquidity, and geopolitical stability are all slightly constrained at the same time.
So this isn't crisis, but it's also not stable equilibrium.
Exactly. It's a volatility amplifier. When you have physical constraint in metals, steady Treasury issuance, and a live oil risk premium emerging, small shocks travel faster. Now let's talk drift. Silver continues to trade like a physical first market. When inventories are tight and settlement matters, price discovery becomes more sensitive to delivery math than to technical charts. Energy risk premium is beginning to reprice. Iran sits adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. Even without supply disruption, risk alone lifts volatility. Policy sensitivity remains high. Payrolls and CPI are not routine prints right now. They are gating variables. If labor is firm and inflation is sticky, the Fed has very little flexibility. Treasury issuance continues in the background. Auctions must clear smoothly. If they don't, term premium resets quickly. And there's a subtle one: confidence in infrastructure. When exchanges halt during volatile windows, participants remember that liquidity is conditional.
That's interesting because most investors still think of plumbing as background noise.
Until it isn't. And when plumbing stress overlaps with geopolitical stress, reaction speed increases. Now let's move into this week. Markets will first react to oil. Sunday into Monday will tell us whether this escalation is perceived as contained or systemic. If oil spikes and stabilizes, the shock is absorbed. If it spikes and holds, inflation expectations lift immediately. Monday brings ISM manufacturing. That print now answers a different question: is the economy resilient enough to absorb an energy shock? Midweek, the Beige Book gives qualitative texture. Are companies passing through higher costs? Are wage pressures cooling? Friday's payrolls report becomes pivotal. Strong employment plus rising oil would box in the Fed. Weak employment plus rising oil would raise stagflation questions. Then we hit Treasury auctions early next week. Duration demand will tell us whether investors are seeking safety or fearing inflation. And CPI follows. That is the week's hinge. If energy feeds into inflation quickly, rate cut expectations get pushed out. Overlay all of this with ongoing silver deliverability updates. If physical tightness persists during geopolitical stress, the metals narrative intensifies.
So the key tension is energy feeding inflation while policy is already tight.
Yes, that's the sensitivity. Let's talk fragility. The Strait of Hormuz is one. Treasury auctions are another. Silver benchmark credibility is a third. And the labor plus CPI combination is the most important macro node. Outsized reaction doesn't require all of them. Two interacting is enough.
What would tell you this has moved from volatility to structural shift?
Oil breaking and holding above prior resistance levels across multiple sessions. Gold and silver breaking recent highs simultaneously on heavy volume. Treasury auctions tailing materially while yields rise even in risk-off conditions. Payrolls and CPI both surprising to the upside, forcing cuts further out. Credit spreads widening decisively, especially high yield. Those are regime signals. If you see two or more together, the trajectory changes. Until then, this remains a constrained system managing stress. Now the shadow calendar. Delivery flows in silver update daily. That narrative can move faster than macro prints. Pre-CPI positioning can exaggerate small surprises. Auction sequencing matters because dealer balance sheets tighten around coupon days. OPEC rhetoric or emergency meetings could stabilize or inflame oil. And there's a 72-hour geopolitical window where retaliation risk clusters. Markets often move before confirmation.
So where are we in the cycle?
We're in a compression phase. Not breaking, not booming. Constrained. Directionally, risk premiums are drifting higher. Policy flexibility is narrowing. Energy volatility has entered the chat. This week tests whether escalation remains a volatility event or becomes the catalyst that tightens an already tight system. So wake up ready?
All right. Knowledge bomb. Overnight, the Israeli Air Force, alongside U.S. strikes on Iran's missile infrastructure, reportedly targeted the senior leadership of the Iranian regime, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's compound and multiple top political and IRGC figures. The stated objective, according to Israeli officials, is not deterrence, it's destabilization ahead of regime change. That's a different category of risk. Up until now, the Strait of Hormuz story was about programmable pressure, smart control, temporary closures, drone shadowing, a $5.7 geopolitical risk premium quietly embedded in Brent. Surgical leverage. But if regime survival itself is now in question, the incentive structure changes. Here's the key distinction. When Iran was optimizing for influence, it avoided full closure of Hormuz because it needed export revenue. It applied asymmetric friction, enough to raise prices, not enough to trigger total isolation. But when a regime faces existential threat, economic optimization becomes secondary to escalation calculus. And that's when tail risk stops being theoretical. Let's rerun the exposure math under this new scenario. Roughly 20 million barrels per day still transit Hormuz. About 84% goes to Asia. Nearly 70% of South Korea's crude imports pass through that corridor. Qatar's LNG, almost entirely dependent on the strait, feeds Asian utilities that are already running tight power systems. The bypass pipelines, at best 2.6 to 5 million barrels per day. That still leaves roughly 3/4 of Gulf oil stranded if the strait becomes fully obstructed. So what changes? First, the probability distribution widens. In a surplus market, oil should be drifting lower. But now the left tail oversupply matters less than the right tail disruption. If Iran retaliates by mining shipping lanes, targeting tankers, or attempting extended closure, we're no longer talking about a $5 risk premium. We're talking about freight seizure, insurance withdrawal, and physical panic buying in Asia. Second, ton miles become a multiplier. We were already seeing a 17% surge in global ton miles due to Red Sea reroutes. Tanker availability was tightening. Spot rates were climbing. Now layer in idled vessels in the Gulf of Oman and possible naval escorts. Every additional mile compounds scarcity. Oil doesn't just get more expensive, it gets slower. And in just-in-time manufacturing economies, slower is inflationary. Third, regime instability introduces a different wild card, fragmentation. If the strike significantly weakens centralized command, especially within the IRGC, control over escalation may become less predictable. Decentralized actors, proxy militias, or maritime units could act asymmetrically without a clear economic logic. Markets price uncertainty, but they hate loss of control. Now here's the paradox. The West's direct exposure to Hormuz is lower than it was a decade ago. U.S. shale, Atlantic Basin supply, diversified LNG terminals, those reduce Western vulnerability. Asia does not have that luxury. China, India, Japan, South Korea, they are the marginal buyers of Gulf energy. They are the ones who must secure cargoes, bid up insurance, reroute tankers, and potentially scramble for alternatives. So even if this is framed as a regional regime confrontation, the economic shockwave would travel east first. And that's the core update. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a lever of influence. Under regime threat conditions, it becomes a lever of desperation. Desperation doesn't optimize for efficiency. It optimizes for survival. And when survival logic enters a narrow waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil, the distribution of outcomes shifts from programmable pressure to systemic shock. That's the knowledge bomb. Not that disruption will happen, but that the probability-weighted upside for oil and the downside for Asian manufacturing just widen materially overnight.
Humor me, quick observation. We live in a world where you can refinance your house in 3 clicks. trade options on your phone while standing in line for coffee. But to buy a car, we still sit in a tiny glass office while someone goes to talk to their manager. Auto financing is the last Renaissance fair of modern finance. Now, I love the auto market. It's one of the purest laboratories of incentives we have. You walk in thinking you're there to buy a vehicle. Silly you. You're actually there to purchase a monthly payment. Nobody knows the price of their car anymore. They know the payment. It's like we've turned a $48,000 asset into a Netflix subscription with heated seats. And the salesperson leans in, very serious, like a sommelier of debt. What kind of monthly experience are you looking for? I once heard someone say, completely straight-faced, I can't afford a $30,000 car, but I can afford $612 a month. Which is incredible. That's not arithmetic, that's emotional accounting. We've basically financialized transportation to the point where the car is incidental. If this keeps going, dealerships will just skip the middle step. You'll walk in and they'll say, great news. For $749 a month, we won't even give you a car, but you'll feel like you have one. And let's talk about loan terms. 5 years used to feel responsible. Then 6. Now 7-year auto loans are normal. At this rate, we're about 3 cycles away from the 30-year fixed Camry. Imagine explaining that to your future self. Honey, why are we still paying for the car? Oh, that's our starter sedan. We locked in at 5.9% in 2026. Great vintage. My favorite part is the faux serious ritual of the finance office. This is where you meet the extended warranty philosopher. Suddenly, we're debating existential risk. What if the seat warmer fails in year 9? And you're thinking, sir, I don't know if I'll own this car in 9 months. There's actually a taxonomy of buyers. Category 1, the rate hawk, knows their FICO to 2 decimal places, brings a pre-approval letter like it's a sword. Category 2, the payment optimizer, doesn't care about price, rate, or term, just wants the number to start with a 5. Category 3, the YOLO leaser, treats vehicles like iPhone upgrades. Every 36 months, a ceremonial trade-in and a fresh Bluetooth pairing. And then there's the system. The system doesn't care which category you're in. It just knows that stretching terms lowers friction and raises volume. The car gets you from A to B. The loan gets the dealer from Q1 to Q2. The inverted expectation is this: cars are depreciating assets. We all know that. Yet the financing conversation feels like we're structuring a private equity deal. Let's optimize the capital stack on this crossover. Meanwhile, the actual investment principle is boring and timeless. The longer you finance a rapidly depreciating thing, the more you're paying for yesterday's utility. But hey, heated steering wheel. So here's the quiet punchline. Auto loans aren't really about transportation. They're about how we price comfort against time. And that's an investing lesson hiding in plain sight. Because whether it's a car, a house, or a portfolio, if you only focus on the monthly payment, you might miss the total cost of the ride.
And now for the greater debate. This is the debate that clears dinner tables. The one that makes people put their phones face down and lean back. Not because they're bored, but because they can feel the ground moving under their assumptions. Tonight's question sounds simple, almost binary. Should the United States participate in a joint strike designed to decapitate the Iranian regime and create the conditions for its collapse? But beneath that question sits another, older one that has haunted republics since Rome first mistook expansion for destiny. Are we guardians of our own character or guarantors of universal freedom? 2 lecterns, no slides, no moderator to rescue anyone from the consequences of their own logic. At the first stands John Quincy Adams, 6th President, architect of the Monroe Doctrine, a man who believed America's power was best expressed not through dominion but through example. A scholar-statesman who warned that if the Republic went abroad in search of monsters, it might find something else entirely, an empire staring back at itself. At the second, Christopher Hitchens, journalist, contrarian, unapologetic interventionist when it came to totalitarian theocracy, a man who believed that neutrality in the face of barbarism is not prudence, but complicity. If Adams feared empire, Hitchens feared surrender to clerical fascism, to nihilism dressed as faith, to regimes that export terror as policy. Adams begins without raising his voice. He looks almost pained. He says the plumes of smoke over Tehran do not trouble him for the tyrants targeted, but for the republic that launched the missiles. He reminds the room that America's greatness was never meant to be measured in the radius of its airstrikes, but in the radius of its example. Once a nation declares itself responsible for restructuring the internal politics of another, he argues, its own political center of gravity shifts. Force becomes normalized, executive power expands, fear becomes a permanent advisor. You do not simply remove a foreign despot, you rearrange your own constitutional architecture. There's a murmur at that. He continues. Liberty cannot be delivered by foreign ordinance. It must be won by those who will live under it. When leaders in Washington and Jerusalem say, now is your moment, rise up, they assume a people can step seamlessly from fear into governance. History suggests otherwise. Remove a regime without an indigenous replacement ready to consolidate power, and you do not get freedom. You get fragmentation, militias, factionalism, a vacuum that does not remain empty for long. He does not deny the brutality of the Iranian regime. He questions whether an externally triggered collapse produces a republic or merely chaos with new uniforms. Hitchens smiles thinly before responding. He does not dismiss Adams, he reframes him. He says this is the luxury of distance talking. The Iranian regime is not a domestic eccentricity. It is an exporter of violence. It funds proxies, arms militias, issues fatwas that cross borders, and suppresses its own people with medieval cruelty. This is not a contained tyranny. It is an expansionist theocracy. To treat it as a sovereign inconvenience is to ignore decades of aggression. The monster has not been sought out, he argues. It has announced itself. He leans in. There's a moral asymmetry here. When a regime hangs dissidents and crushes women protesting for basic dignity, neutrality is not restraint, it is abandonment. The idea that oppressed people must organically generate their own liberation while we watch from a safe philosophical perch begins to look less like prudence and more like indifference. Removing the regime's coercive core, its Revolutionary Guard, its leadership, its command structure, is not installing democracy. It is removing the boot from the throat. The Iranian people have shown repeatedly that the desire for freedom exists. The obstacle is organized violence. Eliminate the obstacle. The room tightens. Adams returns, this time sharper. You speak of surgery, he says, but surgery requires knowledge of the patient's underlying systems. The United States has a long record of believing that removing a malignant ruler automatically produces healthy institutions. It rarely does. Power abhors a vacuum. If the Iranian regime collapses overnight, who secures nuclear materials? Who prevents splinter factions from igniting civil war? Who arbitrates between Persians, Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, each with distinct grievances? A strike may begin as targeted, but the aftermath is never surgical. And when instability spreads, who owns it? The nation that struck. He lands his first real blow. If we define our national interest as the destruction of every totalitarian regime, we commit ourselves to perpetual war. There will always be another. The republic becomes habituated to intervention. Military budgets swell, emergency powers linger. The character of the citizen changes from participant to spectator of distant conflicts. You may topple a tyrant abroad, he says, but you may simultaneously erode the restraints that protect liberty at home. There's silence after that. Hitchens does not flinch. He concedes a point. Intervention has consequences. Nation building is notoriously clumsy, but he pivots. The cost of inaction must also be counted. A nuclear-armed theocracy with apocalyptic theology is not a manageable status quo. Deterrence works on actors who value survival. What of those who sanctify martyrdom? Waiting for organic change while centrifuges spin is not prudence. It is gambling with catastrophe. You warn of empire, he says. I warn of annihilation. He delivers his knockout calmly. The argument that intervention corrupts the republic assumes that restraint preserves it. But what if restraint signals weakness? What if adversaries interpret non-intervention not as virtue but as exhaustion? A free society that will not defend itself or its allies eventually ceases to be free. There is a difference between imperial adventurism and targeted defense of civilization's basic premises. The regime in Tehran has declared its hostility not just to Israel or the United States, but to the very idea of secular governance. To dismantle it is not empire, it is self-preservation. You can feel the room split. Adams answers without heat. He acknowledges that some threats are real and that naivete is not policy, but he insists on hierarchy. The first duty of a republic is to its own constitutional health. If intervention becomes reflexive, the exception becomes the norm. Wars begun for moral clarity often end in strategic ambiguity. You may remove one tyrant, but the precedent you establish, preemptive decapitation, regime destabilization, will be cited by others. Great powers learn from each other. If we justify this doctrine, we cannot be shocked when rivals adopt it. Now it is Hitchens who pauses. He admits something rarely admitted in these arguments. Intervention can unleash forces no planner fully controls. Revolutions devour their architects. There is no guarantee that a post-theocratic Iran would be liberal, stable, or friendly. The Iranian people might surprise us in ways both hopeful and unsettling, but uncertainty is not an argument for paralysis. Every consequential decision carries risk. The question is comparative risk, the instability of change versus the metastasis of tyranny left intact. The late-stage pressure is no longer rhetorical, it is existential. Adams warns that a republic that constantly wages moral war eventually confuses power with virtue. Hitchens warns that a republic unwilling to confront fanatical regimes eventually confuses caution with wisdom. And then something rare. Both men step back from their lecterns, intellectually if not physically. Adams concedes that there are moments when the defense of the republic may require force beyond its borders. He is not advocating pacifism. He is pleading for discipline, an understanding that every external action reshapes the internal soul of the nation. Hitchens concedes that moral clarity can become moral arrogance, that believing oneself the custodian of universal liberty can slide into self-righteousness. Intervention must be argued, scrutinized, justified, not assumed. The audience exhales. No one has been caricatured. No one has been dismissed as naive or bloodthirsty. Two visions of responsibility remain standing. One says, guard the republic's character above all, for once lost, it cannot be reclaimed by foreign victories. The other says, confront regimes that seek to extinguish freedom, or watch them grow bolder while you recite principles. The strikes over Tehran are real. The regime may wobble, the Iranian people may rise, or they may fracture. The American Republic will also absorb the consequences, visible and invisible. There is no applause line, only tension that lingers, the kind that follows you on a long walk home. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. In the orchards of what would soon become Silicon Valley, 1963 felt like the dawn of a new age, but only if you squinted at it the right way. Digital was the religion. Integrated circuits meant logic gates flipping on and off, Moore's law promising exponential power, venture money pouring into anything binary. And then there was Bob Widlar, 25 years old, fresh out of the University of Colorado with a BSEE, Air Force radar experience still fresh in his veins, and a personality that made people whisper genius and unpredictable in the same breath. He didn't look like the future. He looked like the guy who might throw a chair if you bored him. Widlar had already decided the conventional wisdom was wrong. The industry's best minds were trying to cram discrete analog circuits onto silicon the same way you'd miniaturize a pocket watch. Resistors, capacitors, the whole toolbox, and it simply didn't work. Resistors on a chip ate area like it was free real estate. Their values wandered with every degree of temperature, every process variation. Yield was terrible, cost was absurd. Most engineers shrugged and said analog belonged off-chip, in the messy world of boards and wires. Widlar looked at the same physics and saw opportunity. His insight was brutally simple and completely heretical. Stop designing the chip like a discrete circuit. On silicon, transistors are essentially free. You can match them perfectly because they sit on the same die, share the same temperature, the same process. So why fight the medium? Use transistors to do what resistors used to do. He built current sources that didn't need bulky resistors at all. He exploited the exponential relationship between voltage and current in a transistor junction to create stable references that laughed at temperature swings. The result was the first true monolithic linear integrated circuit, a tiny sliver of silicon that could amplify, condition, and regulate the continuous, real-world signals everyone else had written off. It was an operational amplifier, but that label undersells what it actually unlocked. Linear ICs could now process temperature, sound, pressure, voltage, the analog language the physical world actually speaks, without a forest of discrete parts. Before Widlar, those functions lived in racks of equipment that filled rooms. After him, they shrank to something you could hold between two fingers and sell for pennies. The economics flipped overnight. What had been exotic became ubiquitous. Instrumentation got cheaper, audio gear got smaller, industrial controls got reliable. Fairchild's linear divisions suddenly had legs, and the entire analog semiconductor category was born. Widlar being Widlar, he didn't stick around to bask. The bureaucracy at Fairchild grated. In 1965, he walked across town to National Semiconductor and kept inventing. The Widlar current source became textbook. The band gap voltage reference he designed, stable to a few millivolts across temperature and supply, still sits inside chips made by the billions today. His op-amps and regulators powered everything from early calculators to medical monitors. By his early 30s, he had made enough money to retire to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, living the life of a rum-drinking expat who occasionally consulted for National when the mood struck. Retirement didn't last. In 1981, he co-founded Linear Technology Corporation, another analog powerhouse, and kept tinkering until his death in 1991 at 53. The numbers tell the quiet part loud. That single category Widlar ignited, linear integrated circuits, has grown into a $37 billion industry. Not flashy, not meme-worthy, just relentlessly necessary. Every smartphone sensor, every electric vehicle battery management system, every industrial temperature loop, every high-end audio converter quietly runs on descendants of his circuits. Digital gets the headlines, but analog does the translation. The bits meet the atoms at the edge, and that edge is analog. Widlar's work is why your phone can hear you, why your car knows its battery is about to overheat, why medical implants can read microvolts without frying tissue. Look at the pattern, and it repeats with almost boring consistency. Every era has its glamorous revolution. Vacuum tubes to transistors, digital logic to microprocessors, cloud to AI, and the people who get rich on the interface between the new world and the stubborn old one. Widlar didn't chase the trend. He fixed the translation layer everyone else treated as an afterthought. While the Valley bet on perfect binary scaling, he bet on imperfect physics and won by redesigning around the constraint instead of pretending it didn't exist. That's the deeper model. The biggest moats often hide in the messiest domains, the ones the consensus has already dismissed. Today, the same tension is playing out again. AI models scale in the clean digital realm, burning GPUs by the megawatt. But the real world still demands low-power, high-precision analog front ends, edge sensors that sip milliwatts, power regulators that survive automotive voltage spikes, RF chains that don't melt your earbud. The companies quietly compounding in those niches are running the Widlar playbook. Respect the physics, design for the medium, make the invisible interface disappear. The market doesn't celebrate them the way it celebrates the latest large language model unicorn, but the cash flows are steadier and the technical barriers higher. Physics doesn't get disrupted by a tweet. Widlar's story leaves you with a sharper lens. When everyone is sprinting toward the obvious future, the real alpha sits in the unglamorous bridge between that future and the world as it actually is. The next breakout won't always come from the founder who yells loudest about bits and bytes. It might come from the quiet one who realizes the atoms still matter, and then figures out how to make the silicon speak their language without apology. That's the pattern that compounds across decades, across industries, across entire economies. Bob Widlar didn't just invent a chip. He invented the habit of seeing the constraint everyone else ignored and turning it into the foundation. And every time you hold a device that actually works in the messy real world, you're holding his legacy. Small, silent, and still getting paid. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From shifting substrates to tightening spreads, from regime risk to rate risk, from monthly payments to moral premises, this episode traced one line. Systems under stress reveal their structure. Volatility exposes plumbing. Power tests principle. Physics humbles hype. And in markets, in nations, in technology, the edge belongs to those who respect constraints, read incentives, and price the full cost of the ride.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, Nost Moments, because the best investments are still your memories.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.